Hello and welcome. This is Rosemary Dawson, CEO of Customs Brokers and Freight Forwarders Federation. I can see that there are 24 people have joined us. This is wonderful to have you on the line. And our first webinar, and as this is a CBAFF event, I need to remind everybody that sorry, my phone is ringing. There must be no discussion of prices, surcharges, fees, costs, particularly customers, revenues, market shares, or any other commercially sensitive topics. And in particular, I'd like to remind you that no market agreements have been or will be decided at meetings of CBAFF, whether they involve prices, amounts, or areas. And to make you aware that such behaviour outside of meetings is prohibited, otherwise this could cause immense damage to CBAFF and or your company. And should it become apparent at this or any meeting that there's an attempt to make or discuss an item or a hidden agreement regarding price, amount or area, I'm obligated to intervene and necessary to break off the meeting. And should doubt exist whether an activity of the Federation is to be decided on is admissible according to antitrust law, I shall have the allowability of the measure to be decided on or clarified by the Federation's management. Today we welcome Andrew Hudson, and he is from beaming into us from lockdown in outer Melbourne. He's going to be talking about legal and commercial developments around COVID-19 pandemic. And then we have Vangelis Vitalis from the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, talking about New Zealand general trade issues. And he is followed by Bridget Geeson of NZTE, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, talking about New Zealand and regional responses to COVID-19 pandemic. Following that, we have question and answer. At the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button, and I would encourage you during the presentations to use that. And at the Q&A time, we will address the questions that have been posted. Please use the Q&A button rather than the chat button. And so now I'm going to share my screen. And so today I'm going to talk to you about the things that CBAFF has been doing, and you will have all seen webinars that have been promoted by other parties, and this is our first webinar. Our first up, we have been actively involved in industry relationships with all of the parties that we interact with. Port authorities, MPI, Ministry of Primary Industries, New Zealand Customs, MFAT, Trade and Enterprise, our Australian counterpart organisations, and Austrade, carriers, shipping companies, airlines, importers and exporters. Media is another mechanism for us to be communicating with you and communicating the views of members. And in today's Shipping Gazette that has been released today, we've an article thanking the unsung heroes in the supply chain, thanking the trucking companies, thanking all of you, our members, for the sterling work that is occurring, but also raising issues that are confronting you. The current issue is really about detention and how that's going to be impacting. And I've been talking to shipping lines about detention on and off over these last weeks. And we have been sharing information that we receive on a daily basis. Sometimes, I'm sorry, it's been up to 3 times in a day. And I do hope that the information that we are, you have found that valuable. The feedback that I've received has been really positive. So we need you to work with your clients to talk to them about how trade is going for them, and what we need to do to keep trade flowing. Customs brokers and freight forwarders are an important component in the supply chain, as you know, and that's something I don't need to tell you. But we need to be feeding information back into the networks that CBAFF has. And Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade, NZTE, and are working now on the government's imperative to get business moving again. And so if you can identify issues that you and or your customers have experienced. I heard yesterday of somebody who's got had issues with carnets getting accepted. And so if you give me and or other members of my team at CBAFF information about that, then we can help to unravel and perhaps smooth out the kinks that are occurring. And we've also been alerted to the opportunity for illegal behaviour. So now is the time for you to also be watching out for illegal behaviour. Tell us how we can help you. And I put questions there, but then if you can just pop the questions in the Q&A box in the on your Zoom screen, that will be excellent. And so I will be now passing over to Andrew. And Andrew Hudson. So over to you, Andrew.
Hello, Rosemary. Good morning, everybody. Rosemary, can I be heard? Terrific. It's the highlight of my day so far. Look, just good morning to everybody from downtown Mount Eliza, which is about 50 k's from Melbourne. It is, in fact, the coldest day in Melbourne since 1960. So it's just as well I'm locked up. In fact, I think 1960 was the last time we beat you in rugby. So I think that's probably the more appropriate date to remember. Just briefly before I start, Rosemary did mention the detention and demurrage issue, which is a very significant one because containers are in the wrong places all around the world and they're being held up as consignees or importers at the other end won't take delivery. The US Federal Maritime Commission has finalised its rule on appropriate practices when it comes to detention and demurrage. That came out yesterday, so I'm sure we can share that with you, but hopefully some of our shipping lines will pay attention to that because at the moment cargo facility is not where it should be. My colleague Bethany Clark is also online here and listening and has helped me with this presentation today. And the other highlight for today's presentation, as Rosemary would have noticed, is I've had a shave since yesterday, so especially for all of you. So I'm now going to try to share the screen so I can do this, and magically that comes up, and I'm going to go down just going to move this around just a little bit, and if I disappear, well, there's an advantage. Okay, well, there we go. So I'll put this, so hopefully you can't, there we are, just might shift that over there. So just across to there, there we go. So I'm going to talk to you today about obviously some of the international and also some of the Australian COVID issues. Obviously there's lots going on trans-Tasman wise. In fact, we're talking today about, I think one of the first, from an Australian perspective, the first area where they're going to allow Australians to travel overseas to will in fact be to New Zealand. So there's probably, hopefully more capacity associated with that. So today we're going to talk about some of the legal and commercial developments, because there are also commercial developments off the back of this in terms of availability of freight, but also in terms of government, what government is doing to both support export, both in Australia and in New Zealand, but also from a wider commercial perspective. And one of the interesting things in Australia is it now has a provision that says that any investment in Australia during these times will be subject to review. There were previously dollar figures. If you fell below them, government wouldn't review by way of Foreign Investment Review Board, but those amounts have temporarily been reduced to zero. So they're concerned about distressed Australian assets not being picked up too cheaply elsewhere. So I'll talk a little bit about just general outline about the issues, some international export and import controls, some Australian export and import controls, and then a few legal issues we're facing at the moment. We're seeing a lot of talk around force majeure and some related legal issues, and how in particular here associations, terms and conditions, and I'll draw your attention back to the CBFCA ones, has some provisions which might help people in terms of, hopefully getting out of more difficult contracts which might be otherwise adversely affecting them. So there's a picture of me. I'm going to go straight past that because that's enough. It's enough today. One photo of me is more than enough. And my colleague Bethany Clark there, she's been helping me with a lot of the practice over the last few years. And in fact, yesterday we were urgently getting some material through to the Anti-Dumping Commission, and those things are still going on. It's interesting that a lot of the Australian manufacturing industry have asked that there be no dumping duty collected and there be an exemption from that so they can afford to basically have the inputs to manufacture, and government has resisted that. So in terms of general outline, look, there are obviously significant effects to Australian and global GDP. Same thing for New Zealand. New Zealand seems to be more successful with its lockdown, but there will be an effect of that in terms of the economy. I know it's been moved from stage 4 to stage 3 in New Zealand. We've got a lot of airlines having difficulties. Interestingly, in America, where they've had significant government support in terms of financial injections, and also having a similar thing here with some of our airlines being given some financial support from government to provide support for air cargo of perishables. We'll come back to that later. It's obviously having a bigger effect because of the just-in-time supply chain. A lot of companies had survived based around a just-in-time supply chain, meaning it would only get stuff in absolutely at the last moment, which meant they didn't have to store things or have detailed holding exercises. That's no longer going to be possible probably, and I think a lot of companies are now looking at their global supply chains, and presumably your clients will as well. It will obviously affect the entry and exit of goods, and whilst countries have turned around and said that they were going to expedite the movement of goods across the border, there are still issues coming through. In particular, I'll come to it later, but China has put some export controls on export of medical equipment, including quality controls, which will be slowing down the export of that equipment coming out of China, and you might find yourselves with some issues associated with that. It's also affecting some of the free trade agreement issues. So people will often need paperwork to get their free trade agreement concessions in place. That paperwork may not be available because government's not issuing it. So people are going to have to be mindful of going back and claiming free trade agreement preference after the goods have been imported and seeking a refund on that. Through the presentation, I've put some links which I think will be helpful. BDO have put out an interesting guide about fiscal and financial measures. Australia's got a general COVID-19 website, and we're all happily downloading an app so they can trace where we are and who we talk to and where we eat, and make sure we're not in contact with somebody who's got COVID-19. But everything's still going on at the same time. We're also having our anti-dumping investigations are still being initiated, including a circumvention inquiry with respect to certain items out of China, which has just been announced. So some of the international and export controls just before this started, or as this became a bit of an issue, and keep in mind, the commencement date of these issues isn't quite clear. In fact, Bethany and I were in China in the first or second week of January, seeing a client up there who's only now returned back to full production. So we came back and we heard about this thing going on in Wuhan, and luckily we're a long way away in Guangzhou. But about that same time, there was a significant move by a lot of countries towards maintaining open borders. A lot of the ASEAN countries said they would. But there has been slippage in that, and arising from perceived national interest. And there's now about 80 countries with some form of export controls in place. Even more recently, a number of WTO members supporting open and predictable trade. The reality is that that is in fact not actually happening as we would hope, and there are restrictions being in place all the time. So there's some WTO links there on controls. I noticed New Zealand's probably one of the few countries that don't actually adopt export controls, and I'm sure my colleagues from New Zealand, MFAT, will give some information on that later on. My apologies that my video is dropping out. It's a bit cold down here, and the Wi-Fi is getting affected by the weather. So I've given you there some links on some general guidance about international export controls, including from the WTO, from the WCO. There's some particular pages from the WTO and others about links associated with the particular environment we're dealing with. So they're going back. In fact, and importantly, towards the bottom of this page, I don't know if you can see it there, the US regimen is actually in particular important, and they've recently identified some goods where there are exemptions in place. So the US previously had a pretty broad export control regime in place, which prohibited the export of these COVID-19 items. That's now been relaxed, but only in very limited ways. So for transfer of goods to Mexico or to Canada, and also in respect of transfer by holding companies in the US to their subsidiaries overseas. So it's only a very limited relaxation in the US, and certainly doesn't apply to Australia and New Zealand. So US export controls are still in place. As I put there, PRC export controls of medical equipment. What I've given you a link there to is some of the provisions from our colleagues at Austrade that talk about the national medical authorization program out of China, where they have to quality control over goods coming out of China. So that will slow down the availability. You've got to get certification out of China on the goods before they can leave the country. So you're going to have to work closely with authorities in China and have a good colleague up there in terms of freight forwarder or customs broker in China who can make sure that the approvals are being put into place. Now that slowed down a lot of export controls. They're now being expedited a little bit. We'll keep our fingers crossed that it's not actually holding up trade, but you will need to make sure if you're arranging for goods coming out of China, COVID-19 medical equipment, that they have been approved by the relevant authorities in China, and you have that in place. Otherwise, they won't leave China. You also need to make sure, of course, that they comply with local regulations, and I'll come back to that a bit later on. There's also FIATA have also published some interesting material on COVID-19 and the relevant items. So we'll just start that video again, and here we go. So we do also have international import issues. Now, in many cases, they aren't being subject to domestic approval requirements, but we are seeing more of those being imposed now, particularly around counterfeit concerns. So if you are being asked to represent people bringing goods into the country, you've got to be careful that they're actually legitimate products and they aren't actually counterfeit products. And we're finding international action being taken. So they're exchanging information internationally about dodgy equipment, COVID-19 medical equipment. And I saw a story on the wires today about how people are now, it would appear, going onto the dark web to buy their COVID-19 medical equipment and their other medical treatments. So if you're in that part of the world, you're likely to run into trouble. There has been some deferral of import duties, and I'll come back to that a bit later on. It's still important, though, to classify the goods and report the supply chain. I know in New Zealand, there's been a move to provide for exemptions from a limited exemption from customs duty for a period of time. As of yesterday, we've announced in Australia that we will have a similar exemption. It relates to COVID-19 medical equipment, whereby as of the 1st of February, so people can still get refunds, there is an exemption from duty for a number of COVID-19 medical equipment items, but it doesn't apply to hand sanitizer because a lot of local Australian production has taken up with respect to hand sanitizer, and even a lot of our producers of alcohol. So a lot of our producers of gin and other spirits have actually given over to dealing with COVID-19 hand sanitizer. So because there's a big local production, they aren't giving any duty exemptions on hand sanitizer into Australia. So if anyone's exporting them out of New Zealand, they're not going to get the benefit of those duty exemptions otherwise applying. So I've given you some links there to some resources in respect of international import issues. In a minute, I'll just take you through some indicative tariff classifications we've got from the WCO. It has published a list of what it says are indicative types of tariff classifications of COVID-19 items. The US Customs and Border Protection have largely adopted them, as has many of the Australian authorities. So I'll take you through those in a minute, but they are only, importantly, they are only indicative. They're not actually approved, so to speak, as being. So you're going to have to make a decision on each occasion how the goods are classified to make sure that they are being classified properly and imported and perhaps subject to relevant benefits. We're still having other arrangements there. There's business there from the WTO and WCO on counterfeit items. It's worth having a look at that. So if you're being asked to clear goods that are not falling outside, falling within the category of counterfeit goods. A US approach on COVID-19 deferral of duty is put there as well. And there's also, but at the same time, the US Customs and Border Protection have actually reassured, have actually said to their agents that they're going to still be focusing on goods which are subject to dumping duty. So they're not going to let people avoid the payment of dumping duties, and they're going to actually improve or increase their monitoring of those items. I think their concern is, and probably the Australian authorities face a similar concern, is that you've got people trying to use all the, use the current drama with respect to COVID-19 to actually smuggle in goods which are otherwise subject to dumping. So they'll still be looking at that very heavily in Australia, and I'm sure in New Zealand and certainly in the US. What I've given you here is WCO indicative harmonised system tariff classifications for COVID-19 items with the test kits, types of things, then through different types of equipment, face masks, gowns and the like. But these are only indicative, and in fact, yesterday I had a very long education from a customs broker in Australia, how they had a different classification for one of the items, but it was only down to the 6th or 7th digit. So just as much as these are indicative, you've still got to do that important job of classifying the goods properly. Australian export and import controls. Well, Australia was originally part of the group who said we want appropriate, we want borders to be kept open. We don't want controls on export, but they've subsequently moved away from that a bit. So there are now export controls in Australia. So there's a general export prohibition on exporting the goods, these COVID-19 items. There are exemptions though. The exemptions are for personal use of people who are travelling or for their family. There's an exemption for companies which actually manufacture those goods. And beyond that, there is actually an exemption for those who have been already in the business of dealing with those goods. So what they're trying to protect there is legitimate trade. They don't want people taking advantage of this and just getting into the marketplace. We had another interesting experience with a freight forwarder who contacted me and said they've been asked to clear 250,000 containers of hand sanitizer from somebody, and when they had a bit of a look at where they came from, they were from a car repair yard. And it appeared to be somebody who was trying to take advantage of the situation. So again, we went back to the Border Force and we reported that, and there was an intervention against those exports. And I'm sure that there are similar concerns elsewhere in the world, although New Zealand doesn't appear to have any current prohibitions in place. There's also some changes to other parts of the export regime, especially in respect of export certification of plants. That's going to be a bit slower than otherwise has been the case from Australia, because the Department of Agriculture just doesn't have the appropriate resources to cover off on all those things right now. But I've given you some more links there on what are now prohibited goods under Australian regulation. There's a reference there to an Australian customs notice about how the new export regulations work. And at the same time, our Minister for Home Affairs Mr. Dutton has been out and said we will put people in jail for sending face masks and sanitizer to China around those export controls. So there's a pretty big warning there, and they can be done, but only in limited circumstances. There's a new Austrade website on it, and I know that there are various New Zealand government websites about it. Part of the other assistance in Australia has also been providing finance to some airlines to assist in the export of perishable items. They refer to them as the lobster exports in particular. So a lot of the industries that were affected to start with were seafood. They're now being brought back online. Government is funding airlines to move perishable items and live items out of Australia into China, and also lamb and similar exports into the Middle East. And those aircraft are being used to bring home COVID-19 items. And there is a government policy in place, and there's some funding in place for those exports. They've increased funding for the Export Market Development Grant, and the financial support has been provided by a new export finance or export capital facility for exporters who can't otherwise get government finance in place. Well, they can't otherwise get private finance in place from banks, because banks obviously have pulled back on professional lending at the moment. So what I've given you here is just a couple of general links about the commentaries. The second point there, you'll find a link about the new tariff classifications of goods remaining important because of the new duty exemptions that were put into place yesterday, but they go back to the 1st of February. So if you've got colleagues in Australia who've been clearing these goods and have been paying duty, there'll be an opportunity to get refunds based on the changes that were actually announced yesterday. So we've still got issues they're bringing into Australia. Some of the goods, in particular, some of the sanitizer still has to get TGA or Therapeutic Goods Authority approval into Australia, and potentially NICNAS, our industrial chemicals regime as well. So just because there's an increased demand and they might not be having to pay duty on it, you still have to go through the approvals process, and also very careful on how you advertise it, to make sure you're not advertising it in an inappropriate fashion to say that it's a cure, for example. And just some of the related legal issues we're seeing, and Bethany and I have been working on these quite significantly recently. We're having a lot of issues around force majeure, where people are trying to get out of shipping contracts or production contracts or sales contracts. Most of those contracts have provisions, what we call boilerplate provisions, that refer to expressly or otherwise something around force majeure. So if something out of the ordinary happens, are we able to pull out of this contract? And that's often referred to as acts of God, but there are often related issues such as pandemic, such as interruption through war and the like. And some of those provisions are being invoked and people are pulling out of contracts, some shipping contracts and the like. You've got to go back to the relevant contract and see whether there is a right to do it, and you've even then have to give notice and go through a particular process to properly invoke force majeure to exit a contract properly. There are some also related legal concepts of what we call frustration. So if the contract can't be conducted or can't be carried out for a long time because of COVID-19, that might be an opportunity to withdraw from the contract. And similarly, the legal concept of impossibility. So if you can't ship goods because on a particular cargo lane because there's no ships, it's impossible to do it. Therefore, that's a provision to pull out. We're involved in the CBFCA terms and conditions, and there's a variety of provisions there that people may wish to look at and invoke to try and eliminate, to try and pull out of contracts. But it isn't just something you can do automatically. There will be a mechanism to follow, and it'll have to be followed. There are also issues overseas with abandoned goods, and a lot of goods coming into Australia have been what we call abandoned. Consignees or importers aren't taking delivery. Freight forwarders and brokers are saying, what can we do? The government won't intervene very much. It will only be if those goods are particularly dangerous or difficult to deal with. Otherwise, most brokers and forwarders are going to have to take possession of the goods, de-hire the containers, and then sell the goods to try and recover their losses. And there's also increases in stevedoring and other fees, and hopefully we can actually manage those so they don't go up. So, and I've given you some useful links about that. Actually, with that, I will hand back to Laura and Rosemary. Thank you for your time, and I'll be available to do some Q&A, and thank you for your attendance today. And I think working collaboratively as we have been here in industry, and certainly you have been in New Zealand, we can help to manage these issues. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We have a questions, a couple of questions that will be answered at the end, but the webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the CBAFF website, and the presentations that are used during the presentation will be made available to attendees. And so now I'd like to welcome Vangelis Vitalis from MFAT. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. And if I could hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. I listened with great interest to Andrew's thought-provoking presentation, because indeed many of the challenges that he has identified are common ones across the Tasman for us, as they are for our colleagues in Australia. What I thought I would do is give you a snapshot overview of how we are seeing the external kind of trade environment at present, and then turn very briefly to what the New Zealand response is and will be in the immediate and then through to the short to medium term, and then of course very happy to answer questions. So just to start with, in terms of the context, it is clear this is not a normal situation in international trade. The World Trade Organization estimates that we will lose between 13 and 32% of our of global trade flows. To give you a sense of those numbers, we haven't seen those kinds of numbers. There is no data series that can compare to that kind of contraction in world trade flow. So it's obviously a very significant impact for us. So that 13 to 32% contraction in global trade flows is the overriding assessment. For New Zealand itself, in March, our March figures held up reasonably well in terms of exports, for example. In fact, they were up 3.8% in March this year compared to March last year. However, the situation has clearly caught up with us, because our latest figures in April suggest that overall exports are down 14%. I believe the figure is slightly higher for Australia, and imports are down for us in New Zealand by 21%. So quite significant drops that I think reflect very much the changes in air freight capacity and the very significant damage that's been done to those points of connectivity for New Zealand internationally. It's worth remembering that about 80% of the air freight that comes into New Zealand comes in through passenger planes. And of course, those passenger planes are not flying at the moment. So we've had a very significant impact right there. The second point I wanted to make, and just in terms of that global context, and perhaps of particular interest to the people listening to this, is the rising levels of international protectionism, particularly around medical products and COVID-19 goods. So to give you a sense of that, over the last 14 days, more than 100 new protectionist measures have been implemented. They include the kinds of things that Andrew talked about: export restrictions, tariff hikes, bans, those kinds of measures. More than 75 WTO members have been engaged in this kind of activity. And obviously that is a growing challenge, I think, for us as we look out into the future, both in terms of access to supply, but also in terms of the price effects that this will clearly have as the supply has therefore tightened and demand has increased. So you have, on the one hand, you have this external environment that's become very challenging for trade flows, this very sharp decline, both in imports and exports. And at the same time, we have rising levels of protectionism, particularly in the medical sector. With that as the kind of the framing context, I wanted to offer the outlines of the New Zealand government response to this. The first part is and I like to think of it in three parts, then sort of two essential parts. One is the immediate term work that we're doing, And then the second pillar of work is the short to medium term that is starting to focus on what will be a trade-led economic recovery. So just on the first set, which is the immediate term, that's essentially in two parts. One has been very tightly focused on supply chains work, and that is, to put it very simply, it is about getting medical equipment, PPEs, and COVID-19 related products into New Zealand, bearing in mind that upwards of 55% of that product before the crisis came in on via air freight. So with the collapse of the passenger travel, we've had to think pretty creatively about how we re-establish those supply lines. And much like Australia, we've set up an air freight program, essentially, to help companies bring in product, but also to bring New Zealand product out into the world. And that's where New Zealand, indeed like Australia, has something of an advantage because we're a net food exporter. And of course, food is in very high demand at present. So one of the early examples of this has been the New Zealand-Singapore air freight arrangement that was struck about nearly 10 days ago now. And that has now had we're coming up to our second flight shortly, air freight flights that for us took a lot of chilled horticulture and primary products out to Singapore to meet their needs, and brought into New Zealand a number of things that we needed, including, for example, COVID-19 testing kits. So very important to kind of sustain and stabilize those supply chains in very practical ways. And that's certainly been the immediate term focus. I said there were two elements to the immediate term focus. The second is very much pushing back against the kind of protectionism that Andrew described and that I mentioned earlier with the 100 new measures, 75 countries, 75 WTO members implementing those kinds of measures. And our attempt to push that back has been to make the point that the one thing that made the Great Depression last longer and harder to get out of was global protectionism, with countries imposing tariffs on one another. And what we don't want is to be falling into that trap all over again. So New Zealand, together with Singapore, put together a joint ministerial statement, and that pledged to keep supply lines open, including for food, but also crucially for medicines and COVID-19 products. I'm really pleased that that statement now includes 11 other countries, including New Zealand and Singapore. It includes Australia, Canada, Chile, Uruguay, and others. So a very important signal to the world that there are some countries, at least, that continue to believe that keeping supply lines open is important, both to feed our populations, but also to make sure that we can deal with the public health crisis that's underway. To give practical effect to that, and Andrew, you did mention this, we have eliminated the tariffs on a range of COVID-19 products to make these products as cheap as possible for New Zealanders here. So to give you a very practical example, the tariff on soap used to be 5%, which added 5% to the cost of soap in the supermarket for the consumer. And of course, we know that washing your hands is, of course, a crucial element of fighting this virus. So the elimination of that tariff, I think, was a very significant kind of attempt to show how trade policy can contribute to trying to address this crisis. So that was our immediate term set of objectives. Those continue. We continue to work on that. We are having an announcement today, together with Australia and a number of other countries. In fact, while I'm speaking now, a significant announcement, because it includes countries like Korea joining this initiative, again, pledging to keep supply lines open, showing that we want to take meaningful trade measures that allow our populations to get access to medical products and medical equipment. That's our immediate term focus, the supply chains work, and then the pushing back against protectionism, working with other countries, including, crucially, of course, Australia. The second part of what we're looking to do is what we're calling the short to medium term focus. And there's essentially 3 R's that we're calling that strategy. The first is retooling exporter assistance. The second is refreshing and reinvigorating the trade and economic policy architecture. And the third is refocusing and refreshing our international relationships. So on the first, the retooling of exporter assistance, This has been very much a focus for all of a number of government agencies. Obviously, my ministry, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, but together with our trade promotion colleagues from NZTE, also our Ministry of Primary Industries, our customs colleagues, immigration and others. What we're looking to do is to recalibrate and upscale the resource we provide to exporters looking to do business offshore, recognizing that for many exporters, they won't be able to travel, for instance, and they won't have their normal points of connectivity internationally. So instead, we're going to use our offshore network to support exporters in very practical ways. So to give you an example, companies that can no longer visit their clients, they will be able to ask us, and we will be able to send colleagues from our embassies, our trade commissioners, to go and look after those customers and clients offshore and provide more of a curated service. We're also looking to expand the number of companies that we will help and upscale the resource that we have to help companies break down trade barriers. We have what's called a trade barriers portal where companies can go in and register that they've hit a trade barrier. We then set up a project team to kind of work on the elimination of that barrier, and we're expecting to scale up that support in response to what has been a very sharp spike in demand as our exporters, whether they are medical suppliers or agricultural producers or manufacturers exporting internationally, they are encountering these new barriers. So upscaling the support we provide to business is a major focus for us in the short to medium term. The second part of our focus is refreshing and reinvigorating the trade architecture. So one of the big benefits that New Zealand and Australia and others have had from the international trading system is, of course, certainty, transparency, and a legally enforceable set of rules. Those are clearly all under tremendous pressure and strain, and we are doing what we can to try to sustain those. So we are going to be focusing on working in the World Trade Organization, but also in terms of our free trade agreement negotiations. Those clearly need to be prioritized and advanced as part of our ongoing strategy to build a trade-led recovery. So for example, I'm the chief negotiator for the EU-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, and over the last 3 weeks, we've completed a virtual round. So despite the lockdown, our normal work continues. We continue those negotiations. We continue to push with the European Union to try to conclude our negotiations as soon as possible, knowing that including in the medical sector, this will be an important benefit for New Zealand traders, not least because it will level the playing field in what is a high value and very important market for us internationally. So the refreshing of the trade architecture sits nicely alongside the retooling of our exporter assistance. And the third element is the refocusing and reframing of our international relationships. And this, frankly, is an effort led by the Prime Minister, by relevant ministers who are reaching out to their counterparts using Zoom diplomacy to try to kind of send a signal that New Zealand is back, we're back in business, we're back exporting, we value those relationships, and we're using that political push to kind of encourage and sustain and provide a strong ecosystem for our businesses as they look to get back out internationally. So look, that is the emerging strategy for us in a time when you're seeing global trade flows essentially contract very sharply by up to a third, and the challenge for New Zealand of rising protectionism. We have a strategy here that's designed to push back against the protectionism, obviously not working just on our own, but with a number of very close partners, not least Australia. But at the same time, we're actually looking to be very practical about the kind of support we can provide our exporters internationally. And of course, a very politically led strategy of refocusing and reframing and refreshing our international bilateral relationships as well. So look, I'll stop there. I hope I've given you a sense of what the strategy is that is going to take us out. I'm a very big believer in the fact that this will be a trade-led recovery, conscious that 1 in 4 New Zealanders' jobs depends on exports. So it's clear to me that the revival of the export industry is a crucial part of getting people back to work, getting incomes flowing, of course, getting productivity up. And those are all crucial parts of our kind of economic future.
Vangelis, thank you so much. This has been very helpful overview. And are you able to stay with us to the end? There's been a couple of questions that I'd like you to share the answers to. And obviously, freight forwarding and customs broking are critical parts of the supply chain to facilitate the export trade. And we're delighted to be able to be part of the government's push to get New Zealand back into trading properly again. So now I'd like to welcome Bridget Geeson, who is here from New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. Welcome, Bridget. The microphone is yours. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you today on behalf of our freight team, which was pulled together in rather a hurry about 6 or 7 weeks ago. There is 8 of us that turn up every day out of our day jobs and to commit to helping with freight. Just wanted to give a bit of background as to where our involvement came from. We are really close to the export customers, and it was through conversations that our customer managers were having with one particular exporter, and we discovered that they had a really significant issue on their hands, which not only threatened their revenue but threatened 100 jobs in Huntly. And we kind of just went into action. I used to work for Air New Zealand, so I had some really strong relationships there. And we started with a conversation with the GM of Cargo, Rick, and then also at that time connected with a couple of freight forwarders that were also having some real difficulties with air freight options, just because the scheduled flights had disappeared and all of a sudden we found ourselves in a very new world. It was 2 of us on the first day, and we set up a My Freight email address, not knowing what would really happen with it. And from that point on, exporters have really been coming through to us with all sorts of problems, really diverse. And, you know, I think there's just been such a huge impact right across the industry. And then we've also really connected with freight forwarders over that time who are doing their best as well to help their export customers. So it really was just a collaboration and a coming together of a whole group of us. Melissa, who's also on the call, has really been helping with it from an NZ Inc perspective. And I think one thing I've noted is that we've worked really closely with a lot of NZ Inc partners, in particular MFAT, MOT and MPI over this period. So we've learned a lot from each other, and I think the collaboration has really helped us respond to some of the issues. We are finding that it's a really constantly changing world. I think we sort of feel like we're on the cusp of quite a big change again, hopefully for the good, as we get closer, hopefully, to some scheduled flying. At the moment, we've had 58 flights that have been completed, that have been up on the MyFreight website, and they've all been charters. So there has been a few scheduled flights over and above that, but that is just the charters, and I think we've got another 72 planned still that sit there at the moment. Some of you might be aware of the funding mechanism for these charters, and we were able to work really closely with MOT and utilise that emergency funding mechanism directly with Air New Zealand, so that charters could go. And I think the basis for that was that we were coming across problems where charters weren't 100% full and therefore weren't able to go out. So there was, I know quite a few freight forwarders have, perhaps on this call, have actually used this funding mechanism, but the idea behind it was around the financial viability, just to really make sure that those export lines stayed open when we really needed them to, and making sure that our exporters could maintain that position that they had in market. We worked really closely as well with Niels from MFAT, who helped us, had helped the exporters immensely with getting freight on some of these repatriation flights, which were going to destinations that charters weren't really able to go to. And that's been a great team effort as well. I think the only thing I was going to do is just share my screen just so you could see the web page. Some of you might already be familiar with it. So the air freight options sit here: freight forwarding, contacts, charter pricing, and just a whole lot of context. What we found is that in the first few weeks, we didn't really have any information publicly available. Once we actually were able to provide the information to exporters, they were actually able to go and help themselves quite a lot, and then really start dealing in a bit more of a new norm. So a lot of flights on here, and also frequently asked questions. The other thing that we discovered quite early on was around imports. NZT, as you probably know, really does focus on export customers and exports. So yeah, we have gathered quite a few insights on imports, and in those early days, especially around some of those Shanghai flights, those imports that were coming in were really important to making sure we got connectivity back for our exporters into China. So yeah, it's been a very, very busy period, and we think that it will probably change significantly. Again, in fact, the web page is due to be updated tomorrow afternoon, and will look quite different again as scheduled flights are hopefully announced. So it will be exciting times. That's probably all from me.
Thank you so much, Bridget, and certainly being involved in the discussions that I was with for the Singapore flights was really interesting to see the whole of government approach to address a political problem. So I've got some questions. First question that's come up is, and I think Angelis answered this, and the question was, to what extent has global trade of goods decreased? And Vangelis was saying, I think it was 30% or something like that. Now, Andrew, I think this is a question targeted at you. What are your views on duty rates if we see a resurgence of local manufacturing taking into account WTO/WCO commitments? If you'd like to answer that, Andrew Hudson, please.
Okay. Sorry, I just had to unmute myself. Look, I think hopefully, and I think that this is something that Vangelis mentioned as well, it's going to be a trade-led recovery, and I think everyone's been in very similar positions. So I'm hoping that governments continue with their commitments under WTO agreements or WCO agreements, or indeed under free trade agreements, and resist the temptation to push duty rates up or otherwise interrupt legitimate trade. So I hope all the countries that have expressed a desire to keep trade open do so, because if we don't and they start putting import rates or duty rates up again, we're going to be in some difficult circumstances. Even a free trade agreement, of course, allows people to increase duty rates or put duty rates in place in the short term in extraordinary circumstances. But I think if we get a worldwide commitment not to increase them, which has been expressed, I'm hoping that they won't be affected, and hopefully we won't get an increase in the rates. I think the short-term exemption from rates, which have been applied for a lot of the COVID-19 equipment, will disappear as the problems dissipate, whenever the biosecurity determinations are removed. But outside of that, I'm really hoping that there won't be a general increase in rates, and I think that will actually happen, and we won't get those increase in rates. What I do think might happen is that these countries might actually look to increase revenue raising, and for example, I could see in Australia that they might turn around and move our general GST rate from 10%, say, to 15% for a period of time, or otherwise impose a levy on income returns to cover the losses that they've been covering. But hopefully no cross-border increases in duty rates.
Vangelis, do you want to add anything to that question and to Andrew's answer? No. Now
I think
we
he might
have.
have had to disappear, I think. Because, yeah.
Okay, well, oh, there he is. There's two questions. I don't know if you heard Andrew's answer to that question about duty rates, and and then we've got another question I think is more directed to you. Do you think the Secure Export Scheme / Australian Trusted Trader will become more important going forward? And over to either any of the panelists to answer that.
I'm happy to talk to that a little bit, Rosemary. I think it will. I think even whilst we're talking about restrictions to trade and adverse economic circumstances, I know that our government and the New Zealand government have been working very hard on trade facilitation initiatives. And one of those is the Secure Export Scheme. And I think that's one area where Australia and New Zealand will be looking to almost like a single window to facilitate that sort of trade. So one set of reporting consistent for both countries. So I think, and I've been actually through our National Committee on Trade Facilitation, I look after the private sector group there, and what I've seen is that even though there's been all this time given over to COVID-19 and border control and health issues, we've still met on a monthly basis as opposed to a 3 or 6 month basis to talk about these issues and ensure that the facilitation measures aren't left behind. I think actually what we're going through underlines the importance of those trade facilitation initiatives. And if we have intervention for particular reasons, they're kept to a minimum.
Thank you, Andrew. Vangelis, are you?
No, I've got nothing to add to that. I mean, I agree with Andrew. And I think what is important to emphasise is that there is a stabilisation underway, and we are sort of returning to a more familiar environment, I guess. I do think that the Trans-Tasman, the Single Economic Market, and the CER kind of concept is going to be a really important one, because both of our countries have clearly managed the pandemic well, and both of us have a keen interest as net exporters in reviving, the supply chains and the trade links. So I think you can expect us to be working very closely together, both bilaterally to kind of strengthen those links between us in very practical ways of the kind of things that Andrew has talked about. I think the really interesting thing is going to be what we look to do together with other countries as we move forward. And I think there's been an announcement today working with Korea, Singapore, New Zealand. I mean, literally, as we've been filming this, an agreement between Singapore, New Zealand, Canada, and Australia and Korea. And that's very focused on facilitating trade, some very practical initiatives around customs facilitation and procedures. And there are also some really important elements there about building out. So the Australia and New Zealand dimension, but building out into other partners that have also managed the pandemic quite effectively, and therefore are really good partners for us as we look to kind of recover from the current crisis.
And if I could just add to that too, I think the other thing which we can do, and which I think we're doing, is we're trying to move ahead quickly on RCEP, the Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership Agreement. I know Japan said it might not go ahead this year because of its COVID-19 issues. Hopefully they will go ahead, but I think if we can do what we can to make sure that that deal gets up and implemented very shortly, and that also we actually move ahead with our negotiations with the UK and the EU. I know, Vangelis, you've obviously been involved with the various negotiations, and I've been talking to our DFAT people about those negotiations and raising issues that could facilitate trade and getting rid of hopefully too complex rules of origin and certificate of origin regime. You know the stuff, but I think they're places we can do some good work right now.
Look, I completely agree, and I really think it is important that we do continue that work. What we're talking about at our end is what we're calling signature-ready projects. Yep. Those signature-ready agreements, RCEP's clearly one of those. That's really a must-do, I think, in terms of sending a signal about the region. I think we also shouldn't ignore APEC. Yep. I know we're hosting APEC next year. APEC will be a really important driver of kind of norms and kind of future rules as well. And I think we all need to be thinking about how APEC might help us build confidence back into the international trading system. So I think that's another feature. Yes, like Australia, New Zealand is looking forward to launching its negotiation with the United Kingdom as soon as the UK is in a position to do so, obviously. And yes, yeah, rules of origin, I can tell you, in the EU FTA are a particularly challenging subject. They are masters at the most Byzantine forms, but our experience in CPTPP, I think, will stand us in good stead there.
Yeah, I think it will too. And look, just you mentioned APEC there. It's really important. Obviously, last year the final APEC meetings were called off because of civil unrest. This year aren't going to be terribly, possibly at the end of the year. But Australia and New Zealand being so close together with the APEC staff, and I've been involved with customs business partnership dialogue and stuff like that. So we're really looking forward to being able to do that. And I'm sure next year, Rosemary, we can include some of that on the agenda for the CBAFF conference for next year.
Thank you so much. Bridget, do you have a final word to say? And
I'm okay, thank you. Thanks for having me along.
Thanks,
excellent.
Bridget.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Thank you, Angela. Sorry, Andrew, my gosh. Andrew.
That was my gender and everything.
That was a Freudian slip, wasn't it? And Vangelis, wonderful to have all three of you presenting today at our webinar. And can I say that CBAFF has been delighted to be involved in advisory groups or other working groups to keep these projects moving. Thank you so much to our attendees. It was good to have you there, and I can see there's one comment from one attendee saying, great session, thanks. And I need to echo that. And to tell everybody again that Andrew's presentation will be available to all participants, and the webinar will be has been recorded and will be placed on our website. So thank you, and I'm sorry I started by running over, but we pulled it back to time, and we're just a couple of minutes over our conclusion time. So thank you, have a great afternoon and weekend, and till next time.
Thank you, Rosemary. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.